Hey everybody, so I didn't expect my first video of post Salvation's Edge final shape content to be about a special ammo sword, but it's pretty remarkable and we're gonna talk about why in this video. So for context, I've spent the last week or so just farming Ergo Sum for every possible role that I want to test, which is more complicated than you might think. But basically I've just spent like 5 straight sessions of farming, almost like 100 Ergo Sums farmed in total. So that's what I've been wasting my life doing for the past week, time I'll never get back, and that's why I haven't been making videos. But hopefully this video will make it worth it in the end, but we'll see. So yeah, anyways, for context, I have a team that's currently speedrunning Salvation's Edge, and one of the bosses in Salvation's Edge, Herald of Finality, people have decided that swords are kind of like the meta on this boss because he's a melee range boss, he's kind of fidgety, teleports around, so swords are a very consistent way to kill him, right? And so as a result, I wanted to, test sword DPS, the usual options like Bequest, maybe some new options like Summon Bonum. But I also wanted to test Ergo Sum because it's a new exotic sword. Maybe it's got some punch, right? Even if it's a special ammo sword, maybe it's useful in some way, right? So in order to optimize damage on that boss, part of the reason why I tested Ergo Sum is for that purpose, right? The other reason is obviously Ergo Sum is designed for ad clear as well. It has a bunch of exotic perks that kind of give away the game that Bungie is playing that we want you to use it for ad clear, right? It has Arc Conductor, it has, Pack Hunter, it has Tikus, it has a bunch of stuff, right? So yeah, that's what I'm going to talk about this video. Now, in terms of future projects, there's a lot of stuff that I have kind of down the pipeline, which was supposed to come out earlier, but I just spent a week of my life farming Ergo Sum for all the roles that I wanted to test, and so things have obviously kind of been delayed a little bit. But yeah, some stuff I wanted to talk about. Boss health changes. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of you are aware that bosses have seemingly much larger health pools, so I wanted to kind of explain how that works, and we'll probably do that in probably like the next video. I also wanted to talk about surges and -5. Now, unfortunately, really bad timing. I spent yesterday writing a script for a video that was going to be talking about why surges and -5 in raids are a bad thing, right? And dungeons as well. And I wanted to kind of explain why there's some confusion in the community where more experienced players are kind of seemingly lamenting the increase in difficulty in a normally easy activity. And so a lot of players are like, why are these players who apparently revel in challenge and thrive in that kind of environment, why are they complaining about this? It doesn't make any sense. And there's kind of a lot of misinformation going around as well. So I'll probably still release that video, maybe with a slightly different angle. But I still thought it was worth it because I wanted to make a sandbox analysis series, which I think Destiny 2 specifically is like sorely lacking overarching like sandbox discussion videos. So I kind of wanted to discuss surges and -5 in the context of the greater scheme of the sandbox. So I thought that would be interesting as well. And finally, I'm also going to talk about new weapons, and part of the reason why I haven't been making videos as well is because Bungie made those -5 and surges changes, as well as a bunch of changes to weapons. I have needed to retest basically everything in my spreadsheet from scratch, and so that's taken a lot of my time as well. But as a result, I will be able to talk about new weapons like Euphony and Microcosm and Still Hunt, all of which you guys have been repeatedly asking me for accurate testing results, and so I have them. We'll talk about them in the next couple days. I should have much more time to talk and make videos soon now that I'm done and I'm out of Ergo Sum hell. Okay, so that's it for my introduction. Let's talk about Ergo Sum, which is the star of the show today. In terms of what roles I was actually looking for, right? I needed every single frame, so a representative of every single frame. So caster, aggressive, lightweight, vortex, wave, and they all needed to have jagged edge, and they all could not have an on-hit perk, because if they had an on-hit perk, if I was testing something like what's the heavy attack of an aggressive Ergo Sum, if I had a role that had like Telesto, so like unplanned reprieve, obviously that would interfere with finding the base damage value of Ergo Sum. So I needed 5 swords which have a 3 out of 8 chance of having no on-hit perk. So something like Cloud Strike, something like Colony, or something like Traveler's Chosen, because all of those activate on kills, or Traveler's Chosen just doesn't boost damage whatsoever, right? So I needed those, and I also was looking for specific roles that people were telling me, were cluing me in, that they thought were good. For example, like Aggressive Frame Telesto, or Lightweight Telesto, or Caster Polaris, or Pack Hunter, right? So I basically got all of these, and I also tested one of each exotic perk just to see how the exotic perk worked, and we'll talk about what I think of those in a second here. But let's keep going with the summary. So Ergo Sum, if you're not aware, is in fact a special ammo sword. It gets 1 of 8 exotic perks, which we'll talk about later, And you might be wondering, because it's a special sword, how much worse is it compared to a heavy sword? Did they just make it the same damage values as a heavy sword? Well, obviously not. That's a bit unbalanced, right? So at the cost of being special, a heavy ammo sword with no damage perk does 39% more damage per swing compared to Ergo Sum. Okay, now Ergo Sum makes up for that because it has a special perk that gives it a 51% damage boost while it's transcendent. Now this includes the 5% boost while you're transcendent, okay? Because I did the math myself, I did some testing. So whenever you're transcendent with Ergo Sum and you want to know how much more damage you're doing, just multiply it by 1.51. You don't need to worry about the extra 5% from transcendent. That's included in that number, okay? So Ergo Sum, the idea with it that I think Bungie was going for is that they want you to use this sword as like a transcendent add kind of god slayer type of thing, where you pop transcendence, you go god mode, right? You throw your prismatic grenade, and that's going to allow you to get ammo back from the catalyst so you can keep slaying out. And obviously when your transcendence ends, it gives you a refund based on, you know, what you did while you were transcendent. And so what do you actually want on this sword? Right, so moving on, what do you actually want on this sword given that kind of power fantasy? Well, it's kind of a little bit complicated because I don't think the best use of this sword is actually what Bungie wants you to do with it, right? But first, let's start with, you know, the first couple columns. We have Blade and Guard, right? Blade and Guard, I think, are fairly straightforward. I think it's Jagged and Sword Masters, right? And the reason for that is because ammo, it might look like it's a problem on this sword. I mean, it literally gets less ammo that's in the perk description, right? And just by default, because it's a special ammo weapon, they've reduced how many total swings you get from it, right? I think it's like 35 base compared to swords, which are like 60, 50, whatever, right? So it's a lot less ammo. However, the catalyst means that whenever you're using this thing in an ammo-intensive environment, aka for boss damage, right, you are always going to be getting ammo back at basically a higher rate than you're using it, right? That's number one. And number two, if you're using it for like swap DPS, or if you're using it just to give an effect to your teammates like Pack Hunter, then you're not even using that much ammo to begin with. You're just heavy attacking and swapping off the weapon, right? So I think prioritizing damage per swing is more important than prioritizing total damage on this sword. On top of that, I think you should use Sword Masters. Now the reason for this is because most of the Ergo Sum on-hit perks require you to heavy attack. And so unlike a lot of other swords where just light attacking is a good idea for total damage, Ergo Sum basically makes it so that you need to heavy attack. And if you need to heavy attack, you need charge rate. And so this sword is not really meant for defensive purposes, I think. And so having like low guard endurance, resistance, whatever, is not really a big deal. I think you should always go for Sword Masters on this thing, given it has like a low base charge rate. And that will definitely help you get those 2 light 1 heavies off more consistently with stuff like Loosened Blades when you're doing damage. So Blade Guard, Jagged, Sword Masters. Now frames. Frames is a little bit complicated. So if we go ahead and look at my spreadsheet, we go to the new reference tab, which I'll talk about in a future video, but we go to the new reference tab and we filter by swords, right? So let's go down here, let's filter by swords, and let's kind of sort from highest DPS to lowest DPS. So you'll notice here from top to bottom, it goes Bequest, it goes Wayframe Sword, it goes Adaptive, then Caster, then Vortex, then Lightweight, then Aggressive, okay? Now, the reason why aggressive is at the bottom, which we'll talk about in a future video, is aggressive swords don't benefit from Pack Hunter, right? However, Ergo Sum aggressive does benefit from Pack Hunter, which will affect the results when it comes to comparing DPS across different Ergo Sum archetypes. Now, the question so many people have been asking me is, a lot of people know what the perks do on Ergo Sum, right? Polaris, obvious, right? Tiku's kind of obvious, Telesto, whatever. People are asking me though, what frame do I want on my sword? So to answer that question, Ergo Sum is a little bit different from regular heavy swords, and the reason for that is because regular heavy swords are balanced around their animation timings and their total ammo count. For example, lightweight swords do less damage on their light attack compared to adaptives and vortexes because they have more ammo and their light attack animation is faster. So Bungie balanced it by reducing their light attack damage, right? Aggressive swords, because they have less ammo, they do more damage on their light attack because they also swing slower, right? However, Ergo Sum's a bit weird because every single frame that I've tested, Wave, Caster, Vortex, Aggressive, Lightweight, all of them do the same light attack damage, which means any Ergo Sum that has a faster light attack animation, any frame that has a faster light attack animation is going to be preferred when it comes to damage profile because all of the frames do the same light attack damage. On top of that, every single Ergo Sum frame has the same total ammo. So stuff like aggressives are going to be favored when it comes to total damage because they do high damage on their heavy attack, but they have the same total swing count compared to something like a Vortex. Whereas if you're looking at something like Throne Cleaver versus Falling Guillotine, Throne Cleaver gets like 57, whereas, you know, Falling Guillotine gets a lot more total swings when it comes to ammo. Okay, so the reserve count is the same across the board when it comes to Ergo Sum. That makes it stand out a little bit compared to legendary heavy swords. Now, what is the conclusion? Well, here is the archetype ranking from highest DPS to lowest. It goes wave, then lightweight, then caster, then aggressive, then vortex. This is assuming you're doing a 2 light 1 heavy combo with 3 loosened blades and Swordmaster's Guard, which is the optimal way to do DPS with Ergo Sum. Now, a couple notes here that I wrote down. Number 1, the Wave Ergo Sum has the best DPS and ammo. So if we go ahead and look at the Sustain tab here, which I've renamed from the single tab from previous seasons, let's go ahead and filter by swords and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So if we scroll down here, we look at Ergo Sum. You can ignore these because some of these have perks. So the top one here is going to be Wave Sword at 2 million total damage and a solid 104k DPS. And then next up we have lightweight, we have caster, ignore this one, that's Tiku's, we have aggressive, and then we have vortex, right? And you'll see here that aggressives, lightweights, and casters have pretty similar-ish DPS values. Casters are a little bit higher than lightweight aggressive, but similar total damage. And then you'll see here that vortexes have absolutely horrible total damage and horrible DPS as well, right? So vortexes, they're easily the worst archetype on this sword. I would strongly recommend not using a vortex frame on Ergo Sum. It chews through ammo, right? So remember how I told you that all the light attacks do the same amount of damage and all of these swords, all of these archetypes have the same total ammo count? Well, unfortunately, the heavy attacks do inherit the properties of their heavy ammo counterparts, which means that Vortex Frame Ergo Sum consumes 6 ammo on heavy attack, which is really bad on a sword that kind of necessitates the use of heavy attacks to use most of the good exotic perks. So I would strongly advise against using a Vortex Frame. I would say Caster is good, Wave is excellent, and then Lightweight Aggressive are fine. Vortex is really bad. Okay, so that's kind of the deal with Ergo Sum when it comes to frames. Additionally, if you want an Ergo Sum for movement purposes, right? Some speedrunners are using Ergo Sum to kind of conserve ammo on their heavy Eager sword, or to get a lot of swings off without accidentally proccing Eager on their heavy sword, and then switching to their Eager sword whenever they need to use Eager Edge, right? If you want a sword for that, pick a Wave, a Caster, or a Vortex, because they have the normal light attack animations, whereas something like a Lightweight or Aggressive, they have like the weird diagonal swing Lightweight, which is really bad for movement. So obviously prioritize a Wave, Caster, or Vortex in those scenarios. Now let's move on to perks. Now most people are aware of how the perks work, but I'm going to explain my thoughts on them. We're going to go from 1 to 8 in no particular order. Let's start with Colony. Colony sucks. Okay, it does really low damage, right? You get one little, robot grenade per kill, and the tracking is, it's fine, but the little guy does very little damage and also self damages, if I remember correctly. So Colony's really bad, right? It's almost unnoticeable. The damage is going to fall off insanely heavily in endgame content. So let's forget about Colony and let's move on to Galley. Now Galley, or Pack Hunter, I would say has really shifted the meta for swords. First of all, unlike Galley, right, so typically when you use Galley, like the actual Gallarhorn weapon, with other people using legendary rockets in your fire team, you would not be able to do as much damage yourself because you're on Galley and you can't run a legendary rocket and Galley at the same time, and you don't give yourself Pack Hunter as well. Now, Ergo Sum is a little bit different. Ergo Sum, not only does Ergo Sum give yourself Pack Hunter, right, so when you activate the heavy attack, you give your own legendary heavy sword Pack Hunter, but it's in the special slot. It's in the energy slot, which means you can run a full-fledged heavy DPS sword and also run this and not really lose that much damage because you're just swapping off to proc Pack Hunter every 10 seconds. So Ergo Sum, absolutely excellent, right? Penalizes your team a lot less for running something like a Galley sword, right? And on top of that, the damage increase for swords is quite substantial, right? You'll notice that in the ranking here, a lot of swords have moved up in their DPS value compared to other weapons on this list, right? So previously, if you were looking at this list and we go ahead and select all, go ahead and look at Whisper of the Worm, right? Swords were not nearly as high compared to weapons like Whisper of the Worm, but because of Pack Hunter, they've gained something like a 14 to 17% DPS boost for free. So when Bungie kind of buffs swords by 7% and they say, oh, you know, we want swords to kind of remain the same, it's a global buff, that's fine and all. And then they give them Pack Hunter, which isn't really like in the patch notes at all, right? And that's going to buff swords by way more than 7%. Right? So this kind of changes swords in the meta, and I'll talk about what the DPS meta is in the final shape like going forward, because I have all these results now. And not to spoil anything, but it's not swords like just by default or anything, but it is in some cases, and in those cases Pack Hunter is absolutely essential. So definitely one of the perks that you should look out for Ergo Sum, especially if you're playing in a team environment, but even if you're in a solo environment, if you want to do damage with a sword just in general, you should definitely consider like bringing along Pack Hunter for a number of reasons, right? Number one, not only are you doing more damage, but these Pack Hunter, like wolf pack rounds, the projectiles, they trigger effects like blade stamina and relentless strikes and stuff like whirlwind blade, right? Whirlwind blade has just like tripled in its viability because its previous problem was that even heavy attacks would just only add 1 stack. So you would need to expend 10 ammo minimum to get up to whirlwind blade times 10. Not the case anymore. Whirlwind blade, because wolf packs have both impact and explosion damage, they trigger like 3 times per attack. So you can basically get max whirlwind blade stacks in like 4 attacks. So this whole like galley sword thing, it's affected the sword meta in a lot of ways that you probably wouldn't expect, right? And although I think Bungie was kind of intending this to be more of a like an ad clear kind of oriented perk, it's really not even that great for ad clear because light attacks only spawn one wolf pack, but it's really good for single target sword DPS in team settings. So galley sword, definitely strongly recommend. I'll stop yapping about it and let's move on to a different perk. So Traveler's Chosen is up next. This is pretty bad, right? The only thing that was remotely interesting about this is the fact that at 10 stacks, you get extended lunge range by like, you know, a fair amount. But when I tested it, the extended lunge range is nowhere near the same as Eager. And when you stow the sword, it removes all your stacks, right? Obviously to give your abilities back. So it's not particularly helpful. And if you want to just repeatedly have like fast ground skates or something, you can just use Lament, right? If you do Lament hopping, it's faster than this. This is slower than Lament hopping. So Traveler's Chosen, I would say, is like not really useful. The exotic effect that, you know, it's intended for, which is like the ability gain, is pretty bad too, because you have to get like 10 kills, which is pretty bad with a sword, especially like a special ammo sword. So I really wouldn't recommend Traveler's Chosen perk. Risk Runner, I think Risk Runner is easily like the most overrated Ergo Sum perk. Yes, you can like heavy attack and walk through a bunch of enemies, and the enemies that dies your arc chaining, they don't like, it doesn't cost any ammo, and it triggers stuff like blade stamina, so it gives you a lot of ammo back. However, in endgame content, the arc chains, they don't proc as often as like something like Risk Runner, where you can like shoot an enemy repeatedly to like proc the chains over and over again. They're pretty slow, like the tick rate's quite slow. And so the damage per second on like endgame content, where it comes to like minus 25 enemies where you're like surrounded, are you gonna like proc it and like walk into a bunch of enemies? Yeah, I don't really think so. So I don't think Risk Runner is like super worth it. I mean, you can keep it if you want to try it out, and it's definitely fun in like strikes and stuff. But in terms of like actual like, you know, rubber meets the road kind of content where like stuff really matters, I would not recommend using the Risk Runner sword. Next we have Polaris. Now Polaris, not to spoil anything, but you should definitely look into getting a caster frame with the Polaris like Perfect Piff perk, because it is the best damage sword in the game. Like bar none, it is the best DPS sword in the game, including heavy weapons. And we'll talk about the numbers in a second here when we get to it. Just even without Ember of Ashes, which does boost this sword's damage by increasing its ignition rate, it still has like insane DPS. And so we're going to talk about this later, but Polaris is like the sword to beat right now when it comes to DPS, boss DPS. In terms of ad clear, I probably wouldn't recommend it that much, but it's really for boss DPS. Tiku's Divination, easy to proc this thing with like a right click left click combo on like a lightweight sword, but in my opinion it's just a worse version of Polaris, right? It does much lower damage and the explosion is rather underwhelming. So I probably wouldn't recommend Tiku's. In my experience when I was testing it, it was like a mini ignition that does a lot less damage than an ignition, so I probably wouldn't recommend it. Just seems to be worse than Polaris in every way. Cloud Strike. Cloud Strike might just be the worst one here. At least with Colony, you only need 1 kill to trigger its effect. With Cloud Strike, you need 3. And if you've killed 3 sword range enemies, you probably don't need to kill anything else near you. And if you do, it's probably a really chunky target, and the Lightning Storm does like not that much damage. So this thing is bad in like low level content because it's just not needed, that lightning storm, especially given that it requires 3 kills, and in high level content is a complete joke. So Cloud Strike, strongly recommend against. And finally, Telesto. Now, Telesto was actually the perk that I was expecting to beat Polaris, because Polaris kind of, I don't know, just seemed like something that casuals were hyping up as something that was pretty good. I was surprisingly wrong about that. Telesto is actually worse than Polaris. The only benefit that Telesto has is that you could definitely infinitely stack Telesto with multiple people in your fire team, whereas Polaris might decrease its DPS, because I don't know if the explosion that it creates with the perfect fifth can be shared across fire team members and like multiply with multiple people. But even so, the damage difference is so large between Telesto and Polaris that like, I think even if you have multiple Polarises, it's still worth it to use it over Telesto. So the Telesto perk, it's like better than something like Tiku's for boss damage, but it's still worse than Polaris. So I wouldn't recommend using the Telesto sword. I would probably stay with Polaris. So all in all, you definitely want a Galley sword and you definitely want a Polaris sword. And we'll talk about my testing in just a second about those two things. Okay. So when it comes to testing, obviously Ergo Sum has been positioned as this sword where you pop Transcendence, you go on an absolute ad clearing spree, right? Obviously, you do more damage when you're Transcendent, you get refund after killing enemies, you get a timer extension, and it's just, you know, this weapon is designed to be used with Transcendence, right? And so a lot of the perks indicate, a lot of the artifact mods this season, including Blade Stamina, Overload Sword, clearly indicate that they want you to use this thing for ad clear. But in my opinion, for ad clear, endgame viability, it's a little dangerous to use a sword for ad clear in endgame content, given that you're going in melee range. Even with something like Risk Runner, you know, if you're not necessarily defending against arc damage, it's not like the best thing in the world. And it's just like the risk reward is just not there, right? There's other weapons that ad clear just as well in the energy slot, like Forbearance and Rocket Sidearms, that are much safer and provide more utility and don't necessarily cost your exotic slot. So in my opinion, for ad clear and roam content, Ergo Sum is not really it. However, for damage, this is where things really start to change, right? So I talked about already how compared to Whisper the Worm, swords have moved up, right? So I think Whisper the Worm is like a good benchmark, but swords have moved up compared to a lot of the other weapons in the game as a result of essentially getting a free 15-ish% damage boost. But on top of that, Polaris Lance Caster Frame Ergo Sum really surprised me. So remember how I said that this sword gets a 51% damage boost while Transcendent? Well, initially, I was like, okay, there's no way these swords are good. So I didn't even factor in the Transcendent damage increase, right? When I was testing these swords and adding them to the DPS spreadsheet. And then I kind of slept on it, went to sleep, came back the next day, and I was like, okay, well, 51% is a lot, right? Maybe it's enough to boost certain swords above some of the legendary swords, right? So I was like, okay, you know what? I may as well put in the Transcendent thing. It's a little unfair because no other option on this list has Transcendent applied to it, so an extra 5%. But this sword is meant to be used with Transcendence, right? Just give it what it wants, right? And so when I did that, I was absolutely shocked to see my findings, right? And I'm not really someone that gets surprised very easily because most of the stuff in the DPS meta is pretty straightforward to follow, right? It's pretty predictable, let's say. Let's go to swords. Let's filter by swords, and let's, you know, there's a bunch of Ergo Sums down here, right? And so you would, if you were me, you'd probably think it was rather reasonable to expect that Ergo Sum, even with Transcendent, wasn't very good. I mean, look at these DPS values. They're pretty bad. And this is with the 51.2% increase, right? And then we scroll up. And then we scroll up. And what do we see? What is this doing here? At 168,000 DPS, doing higher DPS than a double damage perk, Frenzy and Enhanced Surrounded Falling Guillotine, doing more DPS than an Enhanced Surrounded Bequest with perfect adaptive tracking, doing more damage than an Enhanced Surrounded Summon Bonum, the new Wave Sword frame, doing more damage than all of these weapons that have Surrounded, mind you, right? This doesn't have Surrounded. It does more DPS than all of them, and it's a special weapon. It's a special weapon, right? So absolutely crazy stuff. And so I was like, there's no way, right? My calculations have to be wrong. There's something wrong here. I must have mistested something. You know, maybe my numbers are wrong somewhere. And so I double checked. I triple checked. And I went in game. I asked my friend to give me Pack Hunter, and I did DPS to Riven. With this gun while I was Transcendent, with this sword while I was Transcendent, and then I did it with Enhanced Surrounded Bequest. And what did I find? Yeah, this sword is the real deal, guys. It's the real deal, right? Now, a lot of people were saying, oh, you know, this caster frame Polaris is like a legendary Witherhoard. You can just right click and swap off, and you know, it's a good idea, right? Just use it for DPS. Just use this sword for DPS. Don't even swap with it. Just use it straight up for DPS. 2 light, 1 heavy. This thing is the real deal when it comes to sword DPS. It's absolutely insane that just the perfect fifth is capable of boosting this sword this far above the next just Ergo Sum roll. Just, I don't know, it's just absolutely insane. Now if you're wondering, you know, where does Telesto land, where do all these other perks land, I did testing on all of the sword perks that are on hit, right? So perfect fifth, I did Sacred Flame, I did Unplanned Reprieve with like Wave Sword. I tested all of them. They were all underwhelming compared to, you know, Polaris. Polaris, look at this, right? 94k. Does anything on this list come anywhere close to 94k? Not really, right? You have Telesto is like, you know, 85, but that difference is still pretty large. It's still pretty large, especially given that this is a Wave Sword frame, right? So, yeah, with that being said, I don't know. I'm very impressed by this. I didn't expect it to be anywhere near this good. This is without Ember of Ashes, by the way, right? Because you're on Prismatic, right? So just, you know, I don't know. Just probably the biggest surprise when it comes to damage that I've seen this year. I did not expect a random Ergo Sum roll to be this good. Yeah. I mean, obviously the only problem is ammo economy, but if you're Transcendent and you throw a grenade, this number is kind of fake, right? Because you're gonna get an ammo refund back. You're gonna get ammo back. And yeah, I don't know. That's all I really have to say about Ergo Sum. In conclusion, I don't think I've ever spent this much time farming a weapon in my life. I had to farm, I don't know, we calculated the RNG on stream. It was like a bunch of 1% rolls that I had to get basically. So it took me a long time. It took me like, I don't know, 70, 80 overthrows, something like that. Tier 3, tier 4s, whatever they're called. And yeah, it was rough. But I got them eventually, right? I have them in my dim right now, sitting there. So was it worth it? Probably not, right? I could have made 3 useful videos during the time that I spent farming Ergo Sum, but I finally have an answer to what this sword is good for. Is it good for ad clear? I mean, it's a sword, so not really. Is it good for damage? Oh, hell yeah, it is. Hell yeah, it's good for damage. So, as a final note, what do you want? What should you get? What am I recommending here? So number 1, Jagged Swordmaster's Caster Frame Perfect Fifth, you know, Polaris sword, right, for damage. Number 2, Jagged Swordmasters and Wave or Lightweight, up to you, Pack Hunter. Okay, that's to help your teammates, right? It'll boost the DPS of their Ergo Sums, it'll boost the DPS of their legendary swords. And then finally, maybe Unplanned Reprieve, so Telesto or Arc Conductor. I think more situational, obviously, but personal preference. If you want to farm for those, if you pick them up along the way, sure, you can keep them. We have more vault space now, not a big deal, right? But I would say certainly get yourself a Caster Polaris, and certainly get yourself a Wave or Lightweight Pack Hunter sword so that you can help your teammates. So yeah, this has been my Ergo Sum testing. Yeah, I was absolutely exhausted after the 5 farm sessions. I hope none of you have to farm as much as I did. I went through like 3 ghost resets, and I didn't even have to like, I forgot to like reset a bunch of times. So it was probably like up to like 4 or 5 given how many overthrows I did. But yeah, very painful. My video output should be a lot higher in the coming days because I'm not pinned down by Ergo Sum farming anymore. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Look into the new sword DPS meta or something. Anyways, yeah. Goodbye.